Welcome back to Renewable Rides. Today we're revisiting a powerful conversation with Kingsmill Bond, Senior Principal at Ember, the UK-based think tank reshaping how the world understands the clean energy transition. In this highlight episode, we dive into Ember's landmark report, Energy Security in an Insecure World, and why the world is suddenly waking up to the risks of relying on imported fossil fuels. You'll hear Kingsmill break down the new geopolitical reality, how a system built on assumptions of cheap, abundant fossil fuels has left 3/4 of the planet dependent on imported energy and dangerously exposed as global power dynamics shift. We explore why the old dependencies of oil and gas can cripple an economy overnight, and why the new, quote, Electrotech dependencies, solar, wind, batteries, electrification, are fundamentally different, longer lasting, easier to stockpile, faster to deploy, and far less prone to geopolitical weaponization. Kingsmill also unpacks his team's most striking finding, that countries across Europe, Asia, and the global south now have 100 times more renewable energy potential than today's global energy demand, positioning solar and wind not just as climate solutions, but as national security solutions. And finally, we talk about the leapfrog moment already happening around the world, where distributed solar and local electrification are enabling countries to bypass decades of centralized fossil fuel infrastructure. It's an eye-opening look at why the next era of energy won't just be cleaner, it will be more secure, more resilient, and far more evenly distributed. Let's get into the conversation with Kingsmill.
Love that. Well, energy security in an insecure world. What prompted you to dig in on the security topic, Kingsmill?
Yeah, so after all these grand statements, we actually looked at something completely different to this technology revolution, which is energy security. And the point is that, like you folks, for most of my career, I have and had just assumed that fossil fuels would be available at a reasonable price, and therefore dependency upon imported fossil fuels was not an especial risk. That's been, I think, baked into the system, and that's what's led behind, that's what stands behind a 12-fold increase since 1960 in fossil fuel imports. That's why the world as a whole, has felt fairly relaxed about getting to a situation where 37% of primary energy demand is imported. And then suddenly, the United States, under its new leadership, how do I put this politely, pivots from facilitator to predator. And you only have to look at the videos of Zelensky or the Japanese or Korean or UK or everyone else, leaders beating a path to Trump's door, and suddenly realize that if you've been relying upon importing fossil fuels on American-controlled sea lanes, suddenly you need to think again. Will that continue to be available? Will it be weaponized against you? Will it be closed down? Will the Houthis be allowed to take precedence over Europe? All this kind of stuff. So suddenly, I think in the last 2 months, all of us have woken up to the fact that the assumptions which we have been brought up with and using for the last decades are actually being called into question. And then you take a long, hard look at the energy system, and you see, as I say, that over a third of primary energy demand is currently imported fossil fuels. And the big problem with fossil fuels, which is different to almost everything else that we use, is that if you don't get them, you can't have this call. Your electricity, your lights go out, and your industry grinds to a halt, and you can't drive anywhere because you buy this stuff. You can store a few weeks of it, but you can't store years worth of fossil fuels because they're so incredibly heavy. And so it's a real problem for countries now, and I think they really need to wake up to the security dimensions of being dependent upon so much fossil fuel imports. Just to give you a few other observations, so it's over a third for the world as a whole, but of course there are individual regions and countries where it's far more than that. So in Europe, for example, it's half of our primary energy demand. In Spain and Italy, it's 75% of primary energy demand is imported fossil fuels. In Morocco, it's 90%. And then, of course, you've got the whole of the global south where fossil fuel dependency is only rising over time. So India's about 1/3 now, but that's clearly going to rise under any kind of business as usual scenario over time. So, yeah, it's a problem now for now 3/4 of the world lives in fossil fuel importers.
So Kingsmill, if I'm a skeptical listener, I think, okay, great argument. You were talking now about producing wind and solar, but most of the solar panels, batteries in EVs are all coming out of are all imported. Yet your report highlights that the new dependencies are not comparable to the old. Maybe you can spend a couple minutes talking about the differences between the oil and gas supply chain and some of these newer electro technologies.
Sure. So just to be clear, the solution, or a solution, relatively easy solution, is the Electrotech solution, which is to say you deploy solar and wind for your electricity system, and then you electrify stuff for your end use sectors, specifically transportation, and that will reduce your imports, we calculated, by about 70%. So there is a proper solution, the Electrotech solution. And to answer your question, Dan, what's the difference between a solar panel and a lump of coal? Is that a solar panel lasts for 30 years, and a lump of coal lasts for the 1 minute you burn it, and therefore, if your supplier cuts off the coal, then you can't burn it anymore, or the oil or the gas. You can't burn it anymore. You can't get the energy. If they cut off the supply of solar panels, you still got 30 years to figure out a solution. So that really is the big difference. And you could do various other cute pieces of analysis. The IEA showed us that a shipload of solar panels would replace 30 shiploads of gas. Or to put it in other terms, if you spend $1 million on buying solar panels, you would roughly have to spend $1 million on gas, but every single year. So it's a really big difference in dependency. And of course, if you've got this kind of very long lead time, if China decides to shut off solar panel exports to you, well, as I say, you've got 30 years to find out a solution. I mean, you go, you either do it yourself, or you go to India, or you send in your, industrial spies, and you work out how to do it. I mean, it's not impossible. But of course, if Saudi Arabia closes off oil exports, as Europe and US found to their cost in 1973, lines form at the gas station within days. So it's just completely different degree of dependency between the two systems.
Yeah. And I really like that you frame it not only from a perspective of what you just described there, Kingsmill, of supply chain, but also just the duration it takes to install these projects. And I liked your graphic around natural gas and LNG import, and it's like a 5 to 10 year process of getting all the infrastructure in place versus, a solar plus battery behind the meter solution, as an example.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, so we're hearing a lot at the moment about how important it is to get energy to data centers.
Yeah.
So, if you're fortunate enough to have a data center which sits next to an existing, power plant, which sits next to a gas field, then fine, great. But most people are not in that happy position. Most people have to build the pipelines and the connections and the power stations, and this takes years or even decades to do. So, and of course the difference is, if you've got a solar panel, you just stick it up in a field on a weekend. I mean, and then you have to build a grid connection in for solar, same way as you do for coal or gas. And that can take longer, but again, for most people, it's so much faster to deploy solar and wind at scale.
So Kingsmill, you referenced the new U.S. administration, and within that they focused on, and I'll quote, the unleashing American energy, and a big part of that is energy independence. However, you guys found that the U.S. is largely energy independent, at least from the findings of the report. Can you expand upon a little bit of the U.S. specifics that you found in the report?
Sure. I mean, good for America because America has unleashed its energy. But the key point is that it did it 25 years ago. If you take the peak of US fossil fuel imports, it's about 2002. It peaks at 33% of US demand is coming from imported fossil fuels. And then basically people discover shale. And over the next 2 decades, as everyone knows, the US has gone from really very quickly from being a very major importer to being an exporter, and kind of crosses the line in 2019. The point, I suppose, is that for the rest of the world, for the 95% of people who live in other countries apart from the United States, the fact that the world's hegemon has moved from being energy importer to an energy exporter just makes the situation much more vulnerable. Because when the US was an importer, it too was subject to the economics of imports. It's just very dangerous. When you're an exporter, you can't export for a few months. Doesn't really matter. It's not a big problem. And you can start to blackmail your the people who want to buy stuff from you and demand special favors from them. So it's just very, very it's very different for the US. And the problem is that other countries do not have the same capacity as the US does. I mean, there are a few countries, Guyana, for example, tiny countries, few million people that can do something similar. But India or China, in spite of trying very, very hard, has not been able to unleash the same amount of domestic energy, particularly oil and gas, as the US has done. So it's just it's very different for the rest of the world. And actually, the success of the US actually makes the rest of the world more vulnerable in a strange way.
Mm. Who do you find is most vulnerable in terms of your analysis?
Well, the standout area of vulnerability is Korea and Japan. We basically have almost no fossil fuels. You're talking about 80% of primary energy demand is imported fossil fuels, and the next highest level of dependency is Europe. As I say, about 50% as a total, but there are plenty of countries where it's 3/4 of primary energy demand. And then I think it's also worthwhile noting that, again, contrary to popular belief, most people in Africa live in energy importers. 2/3 of people in Africa live in energy importers. There is this wonderful fossil fuel argument that you've got to allow the good folks in Africa to sell fossil fuels, but actually what they forget is that most people, even in Africa, we're very, very low levels of energy demand right now, already importing fossil fuels. So this is a universal problem right across the world that people are subject to increasingly predatory fossil fuel exporters.
And on the flip side, you say renewables, solar and wind potential is 100x energy demand today and 120x fossil fuel production. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So this is the point. I mean, you just do some very simple analysis, which we take data from NREL and Slargis and Mark Jacobson, and you add up for every country in the world, what is their renewable energy potential? How much energy could they get from solar and wind? And of course, we are deliberately incredibly conservative. You can't put. We assume you couldn't put solar and wind on farmland or forest and cities and so on and so forth, and nature reserves. So it's fairly conservative, and even then, you have vast amounts of renewable energy potential which can get unleashed. So as you say, it's about 100 times as much as current global energy demand, is 120 times as much as fossil fuels currently are supplying. So for most countries right across the world, if you need to get energy security quick, and you look out the window, what can you do? You can either dig holes and hope for the best, where you failed thus far to find enough fossil fuels, or you just get on the phone to your Chinese supplier, put some solar panels up, and suddenly you start reducing your energy dependency. So it's pretty clear to us where most of the world is going to go. Now, of course, you do have 25% of the world which is fossil fuel exporters today, and we're not suggesting that everyone's going to go down this path, but enough people will, and particularly Europe, China, India, Northeast Asia, and in fact, Asia as a whole, are going to go down this path of Electrotech solutions because they've got lots of solar, lots of wind, and lots of electrification potential.
Kingsmill, I'm wondering if there's a parallel to be drawn as some of these countries that you mentioned, because of the local nature, particularly of solar, but wind somewhat as well, but definitely solar. Do you think there's a scenario in which it kind of leapfrogs the massive growth of the centralized electric infrastructure and drives more of a local? And what I mean by that is I think about African countries that from a communications perspective really just went straight into like mobile and heavy like mobile payments in particular, and because of the distributed nature of that. Do you think that that's going to be the case here because of the local nature of being able to produce electrons and consume them?
Yeah, I mean, this is the glory of this technology. It's local and distributed, and everyone, at least everyone with a decent government and everyone who can get hold of the solar panels can just deploy these technologies. And I think, again, you cannot overstate the degree to which this is happening already. So from our calculations, not in this piece, but a separate piece, already 20% of the global south has leapfrogged the US in terms of solar and wind as a share of electricity generation. And a further 20%, or a separate 20%, has also leapfrogged the US and Europe in terms of electrification. Electricity is a share of final energy consumption. And in fact, 2022 is the year when Asia overtook Europe and the US in terms of electrification. So yeah, this is another leapfrog in our midst. And, and yet I have all these people who say to me, you can't use the leapfrog word, and I'm like, well, why not? It's happening.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.